Okay, guys, this is part B of chapter 10. So the second issue that Jackson had to deal with was the Second Bank of the United States, which was funded in Philadelphia in 1816. Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Second National Bank. Now, the Second National Bank, what it did was stabilize the nation's economy by providing a balance of paper money and what becomes known as specie circular. Species means gold and silver coins. Nicholas Biddle, though, he was arrogant and he believed that he had more authority over people than the president himself, and this created conflict. Some people, particularly the poor, feared that the banks would force farmers to pay loans, and if they weren't unable to confiscate their land. So Jackson is against the bank, and in 1836, when the second bank's charter is about to expire, Jackson is president. So what we have here is a battle between Jackson and the bank. In this political cartoon, the bank is represented as a monster. So Jackson claimed that Congress had no constitutional authority to charter a national bank. This is echoing Jefferson's argument. And Jefferson had a major issue with Hamilton over the national bank. And that's what gave rise to political parties. According to Jackson, like Jefferson, the bank was dangerous to civil liberties and promoted the advancements of a few, usually the rich, at the expense of the common men, the farmers and the artisans. In the recall, Jackson became president because he ran under the agenda of the common men. So in 1836, when the bank was about to ask for its charter to be refunded, Jackson vetoed the bank. In other words, he killed the bank. That's what it becomes known. Jackson killed the bank. And it didn't help again that Biddle was arrogant. So, because of this, there is no more national bank. And now smaller banks that become known as pet banks are required to issue specie circular. In other words, gold and silver coins to the people. And that becomes a problem because they might be issuing out way more than what is needed, creating inflation. And when you create inflation, that could have a major impact on the economy. And I'll come back to this, but we'll see how it does play a major issue in what happens. Third major issue that Jackson had to deal with was the Native Americans and what becomes known as the Indian Removal and eventually the Indian Removal Act. So we'll start a little bit with the Cherokee. The Cherokee had lived in the northwest of Georgia for centuries, which is right around that corner, and the blue lines represent where they eventually travel. But whites now wanted that land. Cherokee had done everything they possibly could to stay in their land. So they assimilated. They spoke English. They had a government that mirrored that of the U.S. with 3 branches of government. They circulated newspapers, and they had identical policies as that of the U.S. Some Native Americans even had slaves. By 1830, the state of Georgia wanted the Native Americans, the Cherokee, out of the land, and Jackson supported the state of Georgia. So the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is when Jackson was still in power, forcibly removed Native Americans from their ancestral land. Native Americans like the Creek, some of the Cherokee, the Seminole down here in Florida, and the Choctaw. And of course, you see the key here, and the colors represent the different native tribes and where they used to live and where they moved. They were all moved to the Indian Territory, which is west of the Mississippi, and that's where the people wanted. Now, along the way, some troops killed hundreds of Native Americans, and as such, this is atrocities that could be blamed on Jackson, and Jackson could be accused pretty much of mass murder, but as president, nobody ever attacked him. Now, out of these tribes, the Cherokees were the ones that refused to move, and not only that, they challenged the federal government's position in court. So eventually what they do, in 1833, we have a Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. In the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court actually agreed that the Cherokee were considered an independent nation, and as such, they were allowed to keep their land in Georgia. Jackson, undermining the Supreme Court's decision and authority, he claimed that the Supreme Court made this decision, now let them enforce it. And of course, the Supreme Court could not enforce any decision. That's the job of the president, the executive. So Jackson was not going to enforce a law that he didn't agree with. So Jackson gave the Cherokee 5 years to move on a voluntary basis, and after those 5 years, any Cherokees that removed were forced out of their homes. While only about 2,000 Cherokee, quote, unquote, voluntarily left. The other 17,000 were forced to remove. The Cherokee were forced to walk 1,200 miles to Indian Territory under harsh conditions. Along the way, over 3,000 Native Americans died in what becomes known as the Trail of Tears. So we'll go back to the map. So this is the Cherokee, and they were forced to walk all this land, some of it under winter harsh conditions, to Indian Territory. You could imagine that all these native tribes coming together also led to conflict because of the lack of natural resources there. In Oklahoma, which is where Indian Territory is, modern day Oklahoma, not a very fertile land, so it also led to conflict. Let's look at now what Jackson did as a president, since he's going to be leaving office pretty soon. So right at the top, he reinvigorated Jeffersonian traditions of limited government. Jefferson believed in limited government, and Jackson believed in limited government, and he tried to enforce that throughout his policies as president. What becomes known as laissez-faire is an idea of Jefferson. In laissez-faire, it limits the government's intervention in the economy. A simple way to remember laissez-faire is that government has no business in business. So businesses were allowed to do as they pleased, and a lot of times they were corrupt, and they made money, and the United States government did nothing in return. Now, at the same time, Jackson was considered a common man. So under Jackson's presidency, the common man did have a stronger voice and a place in politics, including, but not limited to, sheriffs, judges, and justice of peace, which kind of becomes known as the police force. A lot of states revised their constitution to make it more democratic and more constitutional, giving the regular men the right to vote. So by the mid-1830s, there's a huge surge in not only eligibility to vote, but actual people that are voting. Now, there was a group of people that did not like what Andrew Jackson did, and they doomed Andrew Jackson as King Andrew I because he expanded, or, to these opponents, abused the powers of the president. The three examples that I gave you, the nullification crisis, where he was about to invade South Carolina, killing the bank, and the Indian Removal Act that we just talked about. The opponents of Jackson become known as the Whigs. So they are Jackson's opponents in a new political party. Now, according to the Whigs, Andrew Jackson violated the Constitution, and in this political cartoon, you could see him dressed as a king, stepping on the Constitution with the powers that he himself gave, and a rod to veto any laws that he did not agree on. So that was the image of Andrew Jackson. He becomes known as King Andrew I, and the Whigs were a political party in England that opposed the king. Hence, the opponents of Jackson become known as the Whig, and this gives rise to yet another political party, and we see yet again the increase of democracy. In 1836, Jackson is no longer running for president, so we have Martin Van Buren right here. He goes against the four Whig candidates. Now, these are Whigs now. You see again, your key here, the blue represents Republicans or Whigs, the red represents the Democrats. So the reds, in this particular case, is Martin Van Buren, and the blue are the Whigs. And you, again, see the expansion of voting. So Martin Van Buren defeats all these four Whigs, and Martin Van Buren becomes the new president. Now, a lot of people credit Jackson's policies for giving rise to Martin Van Buren, because Van Buren rode on Jackson's policies all the way to Capitol Hill, or the White House. However, with Van Buren inheriting the seat of Jackson, he also inherited the chaos that Jackson left behind. Because Jackson killed the bank in 1836, by 1837 we have an economic panic, one of the major economic panics during the 19th century. Some of the causes is that Britain banks restricted credit to U.S. citizens because U.S. citizens were no longer able to use paper money, and since not everybody had gold and silver, very few American citizens were able to pay off the loans or the debts that they had. Britain also reduced their cotton purchase and the cotton buying cotton from the U.S. because they had a surplus in cotton. So the South was really hurt, and a major cause of the panic, was having no national bank because, again, Jackson killed the bank. So that was a major one. Not only that, the loans that farmers had, according to Jackson, they needed to be paid in gold and silver. Again, this is known as specie circular, but very few poor people actually had gold and silver. So the only way that they were able to pay was through paper money, but the banks were no longer accepting paper money, so in exchange for not being able to pay, their land was confiscated. And the last cause of the Panic of 1837 was laissez-faire approach. Remember, laissez-faire, government has no business in business, and since the government was not helping the farmers or the poor people, then the major companies took advantage of this and confiscated people's land and property. Some of the effects, because Britain was no longer purchasing cotton, the price of cotton plummeted. Banks demanded payments of loans immediately, but again, those loans needed to be paid with gold and silver, and very few people had it. So very few people were able to pay off the loans, and since the banks didn't have the money, they couldn't issue money to have a functioning economy. This is all because of Jackson closing the banks. Another major effect is that people began to withdraw what little money and silver that they had in their banks because they felt that it was more secure to have the gold and silver at home than to have it in the banks. And again, if the banks don't have the money, they cannot issue the money. There's no money in circulation, and that creates a panic. So this was one of the hardest economic depressions that ever hit in the U.S., in particular again in the 1870s. And the major effect here was high unemployment, prices and wages fell, and there was no construction of railroads, canals, or anything else going west, so the products were just stale. Nobody was buying them, but there was a surplus, and that created a huge panic as well. Here's a political cartoon that kind of helps you understand again some of the effects of the Panic of 1837. You see a hot air balloon, which is called Prosperity. That hot air balloon is coming down. Some of the effects, people turned to drinking and alcohol since they couldn't find work. Some of the skilled workers, you see them here with some tools, also were unemployed. And so you see a lot of people out in the streets, and these other Americans over here, citizens, they're going to these banks, withdrawing the funds that were there. And the banks were depleted of their gold and silver and no longer could have a functioning economy. So because of that, in the 1840 presidential election, we have the Whigs one more time against the Democrats. But the Democrats were accused of causing the panic. Remember, the Democrats are people that supported, first of all, Andrew Jackson, and then Martin Van Buren. And because of that, because of the panic, the Whigs, William Henry Harrison, becomes president in 1840. So we have yet another political party. When we started this chapter in 1824, we only had one political party. Since then, we've gone through the Democrats and the Democrats and the Republicans, and now the Whigs and the Democrats. So the 1840 presidential campaign becomes known as the Log Cabin and Horse Cider Campaign. This is William Henry Harrison depicted here with a steel plow, and there's a log cabin back here. The way this came about was because Democrats, in an attempt to ridicule William Henry Harrison as a poor man, said that he was born in a log cabin and drank horse cider. These were symbols of the common man. So as such, if his opponents are saying that William Henry Harrison is a common man, that's what the people wanted to hear. They wanted a common man in office. Also, the 1840s provides another different method of election here. We have, again, these festivities. You have song fests, parades, social events. In this political cartoon or this sketch here, you also see women and blacks that even though they were unable to join or vote, they joined these festivities. It was a different form of campaigning, a different form of politics from when we started in the 1824, in the beginning of this chapter. Look at this huge crowd. Prior to this, you wouldn't see this because candidates would set up these festivities, these parades to get people to vote. Here is William Harrison's headquarters in Philadelphia. Again, he's a Democratic Whig. So Whigs welcome women as well, whereas Democrats accuse women who made public appearances as prostitutes. Whigs encourage women for their participation in the temperance movement, and that appeal to the husbands of these women to vote for William Henry Harrison, and this is why he becomes president. Here's a pamphlet that was passed promoting William Henry Harrison as a common man in the log cabin, as a hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe as well, and then just being able to help the regular common man. Now, William Henry Harrison also ran with John Tyler, and so there's the log cabin as well. Harrison died 30 days after giving his 2-hour inaugural address and in the cold, and as such, his vice president, John Tyler, ascends to the presidency, and he now becomes president.